So, apparently, we're going to be looking briefly at the alleged expansionist proposals floated by Trump, talking about Greenland, Panama, Canada, and Mexico to a lesser extent. And I think these proposals run from, in some cases, being jokes, some cases being trial balloons, and some ways being negotiation opening points. So, why would Trump do this publicly? Well, first, Trump's an attention hog. He does like to do anything that'll keep him in the limelight. He also may be aiming to push the negotiations for his transition team into the background. Consider that there's a lot of important things going on in terms of getting Trump's cabinet picks uh, through Congress. And so there's a lot of negotiating going on. You'd think that would be the biggest story, but it's not because Trump's floating these other ideas. That may be very well intentional because no one in media is going to talk about what kind of buyout they had to give Lindsey Graham in order for him to vote for RFK Jr. when the airwaves are crammed with the imminent invasion of Greenland and Canada. Now, anybody who understands business negotiations understands what Trump is actually doing. You open with something outrageous, something you'd accept, but you know you're never going to get. If you have some kind of power of sanctions, you highlight it. You say, this is what we can do if you don't take us seriously. Then you have your lawyers, or in this case, team members and friendly media, point out that, in fact, legally, you're completely in the right to ask for what you're asking. So after the target of the negotiation simmers down a bit, you let them know the key elements that are either your non negotiables, which might be a bluff, or potential options they might counter with, assuming you might be actually trying to steer them to those options. So, why does it seem like legacy media can't understand this? Well, in some cases, they really can't. Legacy media is full of very stupid people. And then there are others in media that still function in the Trump outrage clickbait cycle. So even though they fully understand what he's doing, they turn it into outrage, hoping desperately it's going to bring in a few more viewers. Now, some of this is establishment pushback. In a previous video, I spoke to the idea of managed decline. Many people in the Western establishment, especially Europe, function in a mindset where they have accepted the downfall of Western civilization as an irreversible event. All that remains is to manage the decline in a way to prolong the coming of the end. And it pains and enrages them to see someone trying to push back on this. For some, the downfall of the West is actually desirable. For others, trying to reverse the downfall is kind of a rebuke to them. It points out that they might be wrong. So if you've learned anything from my videos, the neoliberal establishment always believes it's never wrong. So, on another note, on the grandiose outrageousness of Trump's ideas, these ideas, the way he expresses them, are too outrageous to ignore. It forces people to talk about him. It gives his people intelligence about the citizens and leaders and how they stand on things. Or, in other words, essentially a trial balloon. What happens if I say this? And essentially, it also opens up back channels for people who may want to do what Trump wants. For example, all of a sudden, with the talk of Greenland, we start hearing about uh, various Greenland groups who actually want some form of independence suddenly getting a little bit of notoriety. It would not surprise me if the people Trump sent up to Greenland are actively negotiating with. So, in terms of Greenland, first, he says, yeah, we're going to buy Greenland. And then in a follow up interview, he is asked if he will renounce the use of military action in pursuit of his goals. Then he refuses. This is the outrageous part. Then later, he adds that there are things on the negotiating table. He mentions that Greenland is a NATO obligation and that Denmark lacks the ability to defend it. He says their options are to defend it properly, grant the U.S. concessions and allow us to defend it, or sell it to the U.S. Now, part of the media tries to portray this as like, oh, it's just crazy, it's madness, blah. But in fact, the U.S. has actively pursued acquiring Greenland from at least 1867 onwards. Greenland has a small population of around 56,000 people. So their impact, I mean, if we were to absorb this population, is actually pretty negligible. The land it occupies is crucial space that dominates the North Atlantic and occupies a large portion of the Arctic. And essentially, it's in a critical position for missile defense and potential future missile interception. It is rich in rare earth minerals. Apparently, it has some very unique geology. There's ancient crustal stuff up there that hasn't been subducted down as it is around the rest of the world. There have been Chinese companies attempting to purchase defunct naval bases up there, as well as trying to build extended runways. So, is the idea of acquiring Greenland a good idea? Well, I'd have to say probably. It would, in the longer run, at least, it would probably be a net economic benefit. Because the population's so small, it's not like it's going to destabilize the United States in any way. We're already kind of paying for its defense anyway, so it's not going to dramatically increase our obligations. Um, and making a purchase, although it upsets people in the West because it ruins their vision of a declining West, it's not particularly antagonistic. It's not something where people are going, oh, that was just horrible what he did. Uh, Countries have been purchasing land forever. It's not a big thing. So, what about the Panama Canal? Well, one of the things that was brought up there was the idea of taking it back. And essentially, immediately, what happens is everyone freaks out, and then all of a sudden, you hear sneak out through various channels like, oh, well, here's actually what the treaty says. We do have the power to take it back uh, if for some reason it comes under hostile foreign occupation uh, or influence, or if the Panama essentially refuses to maintain it in a proper way. Now, one thing that's gone on for a long time, essentially, there's been Chinese, originally out of Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is more or less integrated with China now. Very early on, Chinese companies took over the contracts for doing maintenance on the canal. And initially, this was just people complained in the background, but for the most part, everyone said that's great because essentially the neoliberal order had that pro China stance going on at the time, where it's like, oh, well, they're just going to integrate as a part of the global brotherhood of nations. And so that's great that they're doing that. Uh, However, it's looking like China is no longer playing the global neoliberal order game anymore. So the idea of questioning the idea of China controlling the canal that essentially a large chunk of our economy flows back and forth through isn't that outrageous anymore. Essentially, we do realize that most Chinese companies are either wholly or partly owned by the Communist Party itself. So, what kind of items got thrown on the table after we kind of stepped back a little bit from that idea of taking it over? Well, Trump said he thinks an American company must be granted the maintenance contract. That fees for our ships must drop, basically saying that we're being overcharged for it. Now, how does this fit in with things? Well, um, if the canal is critical to us, and we believe China is a competitor of some sort, having an American company or at least a friendly foreign country running it would probably be better. And if we are in a position to lower the cost of passage through the canal, well, that's a benefit to the lowering of prices that he has promised to do in his campaign. So, is this a good idea? And although our treaties with Panama do allow us to take over the canal if absolutely necessary, I think that would come off as very heavy-handed and would likely sour relations with a lot of countries around the world, especially Central and South America. A reoccupation of the canal zone would probably have a lot of negative impacts. It would probably be really expensive. There's probably a lot of infrastructure that would have to be recreated, and the Panamanians may not be thrilled with it. I have no idea how they would feel about us coming back in there in that way, but I suspect it wouldn't be friendly. Now, an insistence that an American company run the canal maintenance on the surface is probably a net good in terms of allowing the cost of shipping goods. But it also has the potential for some future corruption if the US has too much say so in who gets that contract. Now, one thing I talked about in a bunch of videos was Peter Zehan. And he has a very interesting take on what's going on in the world. He believes the old neoliberal order is essentially coming to an end and that we're moving towards, instead of a global order, an order of trading blocks where various countries will try to do as much in house as humanly possible. He believes this is a function of demographics and that for the most part it's irreversible, it's going to happen. Um, so if you look at the two items, Greenland and Panama Canal, this actually fits very much into his prediction sphere. The idea that the United States will need to circle more and more around dealing with getting its resources closer to home rather than around the globe. So I'm really curious to see what he ends up saying about this because uh, Peter is just completely out of his freaking mind when it comes to Trump. He has Trump derangement syndrome. He practically froths at the mouth talking about the man. So, and it's funny because he'll sit there and talk about things, and you're going, okay, you're literally talking about your theory in action. And he hates Trump so much that he can't link the two together. It's like he is fulfilling what you said is going to happen. He's making you a true prophet. So I'll be interested to see when he ends up actually addressing these particular issues. So what about the stuff about Canada? Uh, in all honesty, I think this is entirely a joke to embarrass Trudeau. I don't think anyone seriously believes that adding Canada to the United States would be that particularly good of an idea, and I doubt anybody is considering anything remotely military in it. I would say this is a joke first and a very light trial balloon second. Um, there would be some incredible efficiency aspects in a merger of Canada into the United States. In terms of military integration, economic integration, and immigration, uh, it would dramatically improve both the economies of Canada and the United States. It would make us an economic powerhouse. Uh, However, I think initially the threat of tariffs to improve border security and address trade imbalances were really pretty much the height of what Trump had in mind here. The fact that people started running with it caused him to basically make a joke about Trudeau being the governor of the 51st state of America. Uh, and again, I think this is entirely a joke. What's kind of funny, though, is that this joke may have actually toppled Trudeau. And other than getting rid of Trudeau, I think Canadian-US merger is probably a bad idea, at least at this juncture. I mean, in the long run, it would be a huge economic boon for both sides. However, demographically, I think it would be worse than making DC and Puerto Rico states. Canada is just the average citizen is just too socialist for our own good. We don't want them as part of our electorate. Maybe if they uh, get an opportunity to deal with a little bit more reality and come a little bit more towards a free market economy, that might be something, in several decades that might be really worth doing. Okay, so in terms of Mexico, uh, essentially the main thing that came up was the threat of using special forces against a cartel and raising tariffs to force Mexico to help enforce border security. I think the very threat of that, I mean, it's something they might do, but I think really the threat of putting special forces in probably scares the crap out of the cartels, and they're probably going to be willing to make concessions to avoid being engaged by special forces. Meaning that if you clandestinely say, "Hey, these are areas you need to stay the hell out of. These are things you need to stop doing," etc., etc., uh, they will probably back off really quick. Because if the intel assets of the United States turn on the cartel and special forces are basically slipping in and out hitting things, uh, it's not going to be good for them. In fact, we're hearing hints that they may already be trying to do things that they think the United States would want. Um, I think the main thing this was put out to show is that the United States considers this serious. We're clearly, obviously, in the last 4 years, anything to do with what Mexico does with the border has not been taken seriously in any way at all. So the talk of tariffs, the talk of intervention, I believe, is to create a negotiating point because there's a lot of things Mexico, if they assist with rather than just let happen, actually make a lot of things happen at a very uh, inexpensive way. For instance, uh, Eisenhower had a deportation program known as Operation Wetback, um, where we deported over, I think it was 1.5 million people back to Mexico. This deportation program ended up working well because Mexico cooperated with it. They helped out. Um, we also had during the last Trump administration the Stay in Mexico program, where people claiming refugee status essentially had to stay in waiting areas in Mexico. This program worked really well too because Mexico cooperated. In fact, almost everything dealing with border crossings, people coming from other countries transiting through Mexico, people playing the refugee status game, drugs, uh, violence, etc., along and over the border, only can get better with Mexican cooperation. So I believe most of this stuff that was brought up is essentially the stick part of the negotiations, and that once, assuming they're not already negotiating, probably Trump's minions will probably come up with some carrot elements of it that will make soothe Mexico's ego to allow them to feel okay with the idea of helping out again with essentially a deportation program, a stay in Mexico program, and basically something that mitigates the problems with the drug cartels. Um, One of the things I think the actual idea of going in and using special forces against the cartels, if we're really talking about doing it, I think it's a bad idea because it has a huge potential to destabilize. One thing people are kind of unaware of is that actually the way the wall has been constructed. And this was happening before Trump, actually, because more wall, I believe, was built before Trump than actually during his term. The wall that was completed before Trump took office the first time actually led to some of the destabilization in Mexico because it created areas that became conduits, basically were walls where people are like, oh, this isn't the best place to cross. The places where there aren't walls are the best place to cross. So these became contested territories for the various cartel groupings. And this competition, well, that leads to violence. And the violence helped destabilize Mexico in the first place. So adding special forces to the mix probably won't make it better. And just add that to the fact that in general, every time we say we have a military option for some place around the world, the outcome generally isn't what's advertised. So, what do you think about the various Trump initiatives that have been popping out? Do you think they're entirely hot air? Or are they there to basically hide what's going on in the background, keep the news media occupied? Do you think uh, any of these are the idea of Greenland being added to the United States, or Canada being added to the United States, or the Panama Canal being re-seized, something real? Do you think we're really planning on using special forces in Mexico? What's your opinion on any of these? I'm curious how other people are reading them. I mean, obviously, I'm reading them. Please hit the like button or smash it, as the other kids say. Uh, if the YouTube algorithm's brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please check out my other titles. You'll probably want to subscribe after that. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.